stupid rich Dutch. I really want to put them back in their place. Me too! And I really want to centralize my power. Me too! And spread the Catholic faith. Me too! Leute, did we just become best friends forever? The early modern period. The time of pike and shot, of renewed Rome fanboying, and wig wearing. The period began with the Habsburg dynasty at the apex of their power. Especially their Spanish branch was enjoying the wealth they sucked out of their American colonies. It also saw religious tensions thanks to the Protestant Reformation. This paved the way for the decline of the traditional European powers of the Habsburg-ruled Holy Roman Empire and Spain. This in turn paved the way for the rise of France. Though never really a weak player, they had always been held back by their weak central government. The nobles were often looking out for themselves, most famously in the 100 Years' War. But recently in the 17th century, their powers had been put in check by Louis XIV. Louis had been investing in things like the arts and army of France, and enjoyed being in the center of attention, kind of like the Sun. Sun King. After having played Apollo on stage, Louis was ready to shine his light on a different kind of theater, the theater of war. See, with the decimation the religious wars had wreaked in the German lands, France was now the most populous and richest country in Europe. This meant that France could field a truly massive army. In the War of Devolution, Louis tried to conquer the Spanish-held Franche-Comté and their Dutch holdings, basically modern-day Belgium. But he was put in check by an upstart country. The United Provinces, the forerunner of the Netherlands, also profited from the Habsburg decline. They had fought the 80 Years' War against Spain to win their independence, and were now enjoying their golden age, a period of economic and cultural prosperity. Many aspects of their state were rather decentralized, from the local governance to their fleet. The most centralized organization was a national army, and its leader and the unofficial ruler of the country was the stadtholder, a position in the hands of the Orange-Nassau dynasty. By the early 17th century, this was William II. But this was also a century where monarchs and local power holders fought over influence. Think of the English Civil War and the Fronde in France. So too did William II try to become an absolute ruler, and his coup d'etat in 1650 seemed to succeed. And then he died. His only son, William, wouldn't be born until 8 days after his death. Thus the regenten, or rich families, seized their opportunity and did not appoint baby William as stadtholder. The first stadtholderless period had begun. Shortly after, Johan de Witt became raadspensionaris, basically prime minister. His rule saw an economic boom from overseas commerce, but also a split in Dutch society between Orangists and Statists. As the name implies, the first were loyalists to the Nassaus and wished to see William appointed stadtholder. They were often members of the nobility and lower classes. They had a vested interest in strengthening the army, as that was the source of the stadtholder's influence. On the other side were the Statists, who wanted the United Provinces to be rid of the monarchist elements that the stadtholders represented and to create a true republic. Their supporters were often city officials and rich merchants, so they were more interested in naval and commercial interests. And with the Statists now in control, the navy became one of the strongest in Europe, while the army was being neglected. But that won't have any consequences, right? Anyway, de Witt tried to keep the peace through diplomacy. So when Louis was kicking Spanish butt, he created a triple alliance with Sweden and England, and forced the French to limit their gains. Louis took this personally, so he started to plan a war of revenge against the Dutch. He convinced the English and Swedish out of their alliance, and England even joined his war plans, as they had some leftover grudges with the Dutch over commerce. Their recently returned king also had dynastic ties to the Nassaus, which made him dislike the Cromwell-esque de Witt. France found two more allies in the bishoprics of Münster and Cologne. The ambitious bishop of Münster, Bernard von Galen, had a territorial dispute with the Dutch over Borculo, while the one of Cologne, Maximilian Heinrich von Beieren, ruled from the city of Bonn, as the city of Köln was not part of a secular territory, and that city had strong economic ties to the Dutch, so he was also in. Now only one hurdle remained for the French: the Holy Roman Emperor. It was a small hurdle though. The Habsburg Leopold I basically said, yeah, whatever, just leave the imperial and Spanish territories alone. Let's now crunch some numbers. See, France had an experienced army, having recently fought the War of Devolution and the invasion of Lorraine. But their army was also truly massive for its time, numbering in the 120,000s, assisted by 30,000 troops from her German allies and the English fleet. Against them stood about 40,000 troops from the Dutch, but due to administrative deficiencies, this number was probably even lower. Their strength was also hindered by the dispute between the Orangists and Statists over who should lead the army. On the eve of war, a compromise was reached where William would temporarily lead the army. William was not very imposing. He was an asthmatic, frail-bodied boy who was quickly overwhelmed by his new workload. The defense of the United Provinces consisted of 3 phases. The first phase was one of the most modern and strongest forts of its time that overlooked the Meuse River, Maastricht. The second were a series of forts on the Rhine that were in serious disrepair by now. These 2 were only meant to slow the advance, and all hope rested on the IJssel line. If the army could hold the enemy at this river, the richest provinces would be safe. And their plans would now be put to the test. On the 23rd of March, 1672, the Dutch got bad news from the Mediterranean. The English had sunk a fleet off the coast of Anatolia, followed 4 days later by a declaration of war, and then one from the French on the 6th of April.
So it begins.
Louis was ready to unfurl himself as a soldier king and was assisted by 2 very capable generals, the Prince of Condé and the Viscount of Turenne. His Minister of War, the Marquis of Louvois, was also a logistical genius and had set up a supply system throughout the colonial lands to allow the army to move rapidly without foraging or plundering. When they reached Maastricht, instead of besieging it like Condé suggested, Louis listened to Turenne and marched onwards while leaving behind a small force. Louis wanted to start the war flashy, not with a drawn-out siege, and flashy is what he got. The dilapidated Rhine force proved no match and quickly surrendered. The Schrenkenschans was now the last obstacle in front of the IJssel line. The only shining light for the Dutch was the Battle of Solbay, where Michiel de Ruyter prevented a naval blockade and an amphibious assault on the country. With de Witt's diplomatic shield broken, the Dutch were frantically looking for new allies, but afraid of French reprisals, the sympathetic countries could only provide thoughts and prayers. Their last hope was Brandenburg, Prussia. Its ruler Frederick William, the Great Elector, was still sitting on a fence. On the one hand, he was sympathetic to the Protestant Dutch and saw it as his duty to aid them, and was also afraid that his western possessions were being endangered. But at the same time, aiding the clearly weaker side would put those possessions in even more danger, and many at this court were either impressed or intimidated by the French. But in the end, he chose the Dutch side. Back in the Netherlands, the commander of the Schrenkenschans decided to abandon his post. Mortified, William sent a small army to halt the French advance. They came to blows at Lobith on the 12th of June, the first real battle of the Franco-Dutch War, which the Dutch lost. The French could now freely cross the Rhine, leaving the IJssel line open to flanking. Holding the IJssel was now untenable, and the Dutch were forced to retreat. This left the eastern provinces bare, and on their retreat, a flaw in the decentralized recruitment of the army became apparent, as the provinces that were left defenseless by the retreat recalled their troops so they could mount an ultimately futile defense, and the proud army of William shrunk to a measly demoralized force of 9,000, while barely having fired a shot. The French meanwhile overran Gelders and Utrecht, while her German allies under the leadership of von Galen, soon to be known as Bommen-Berend, took Overijssel and marched on Drenthe. The rapid advance, combined with the savage reputation of the French troops, led to an exodus of war refugees, as many nobles and peasants alike tried to flee westwards. Angered by the merchant classes, who seemed to be more interested in saving their own belongings, the lower classes started overthrowing city government after city government and forcefully seized control. The Republic seemed to come apart at the seams. But now it was the French turn to make a strategic blunder. They took the traditional military approach of consolidating their gains, because leaving behind enemy forts endangered your supply lines and rearguard. And you can't leave behind too many ongoing sieges, as this would, like in Maastricht, sap your manpower. But had they marched onwards to smash William's meager force, or marched on the unfortified capital of The Hague, they would have saved themselves all of the coming hardships. See, the Dutch still had one last trick up their sleeve, the Hollandic waterline. It was based on a project from 1629 for the 80 Years' War. It had never been put to the test, but now it came in quite handy. The idea was to inundate, or flood, large stretches of lands to make them impenetrable. And the 5 most fordable sections were protected by these forts. After some logistical setbacks, and understandable sabotage by local farmers, the waterline was functional in early July. Surprisingly, the French didn't bring any boats for their land campaign. So for now, the Dutch were safe. The Dutch patrolled the waterline with small boats called uitleggers. These small, flat-bottomed vessels could often carry about 10 men and were armed with cannons so they could pepper any French forces trying to cross the waterline via higher paths. With this stalemate, Turenne went eastwards to meet the army of Frederick William and led François-Henri de Montmorency in charge, better known as the Duke of Luxembourg. He was one of the boys and preferred to be in the thick of it during fighting. He was also fond of letting soldiers do what occupying soldiers tend to do. Within a month, the French alliance had reduced the United Provinces to only Holland, Zeeland, Friesland and Groningen. I'm not going to focus on the northern provinces too much, as I already covered this front in my last video on Frisian history, which you can check out here or in the description when you're done with this one. But in short, they too were hiding behind their own waterline or rough terrain. The three commanders William, Van Alva and Von Rabenhaupt each had unenviable positions on their fronts, while the French and friends were enjoying spoils in the occupied areas. The only hope for the Dutch was now the advancing Brandenburg. But would they prove to be enough? The saying goes for this period: the government is clueless, the people reasonless, and the country is helpless. The truthfulness of this saying reached its peak in July and August. The people were furious at the previous government for their handling of the war, and this anger was aimed at de Witt and his supporters. City officials tried to save their own skins by attempting to associate themselves with William and to distance themselves from de Witt. In August, Johann's brother, Cornelis, was accused of planning to assassinate William. Afraid of the people's wrath if they declared him innocent, the court punished him with banishment. But the angered people thought this was not harsh enough. So when Johann came to The Hague to pick him up, they were trapped in a prison by a mob. The soldiers sent to protect the two brothers turned on them, and on the 21st of August they stormed the prison and lynched them. The mob then defiled the bodies. They cut off body parts and removed organs which were sold as grim souvenirs. Rather famously, some people even took small bites out of them. The political class now feared the populace, and many locked themselves in their homes. It is likely that William was involved with the murder, although to what extent is not entirely confirmed. Some argue he was directly involved in planning the act, while others say he was only indirectly involved by spreading inflammatory pamphlets. What is certain, however, is that he used the gruesome murder to his advantage. The local government of Holland authorized him to appoint new government officials. In July, William had already been made permanent commander. So now he was not only the military, but also the de facto political leader of the United Provinces. William began as a small, weak boy, but had grown into a capable, steadfast, and uncompromising leader. The Dutch people saw him as their only hope, a reputation he was very willing to play into. However, he was still inexperienced, and surrounded himself with more seasoned commanders. While his army had grown to about 57,000 men, good news came from the north. On the 23rd of August, Blokzeil became the first recaptured city, and 5 days later von Galen was forced to give up his critical siege of Groningen. Then the Dutch autumn came, and that means rain. Lots of it. The French troops were unaccustomed to such miserable weather, and were growing cold and frustrated. Luxembourg allowed his troops to go and vent their frustration on small villages like Hilversum. This plundering had another goal. The French wanted to intimidate the Dutch and force them to their knees, but it only strengthened their resolve. But by now there was little left of the Turbo army that had invaded the Netherlands. After Louis and Turenne had siphoned off troops for other fronts, he was left with only 40,000 men. And after garrisoning occupied towns, only 8 were left for any offensive actions. In the meantime, the Brandenburg force arrived in Halberstadt. There were 2 conditions for their aid. Frederick William wanted the Dutch to front a part of the bill, and that the Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, supported the campaign. But Leopold didn't want to fully commit. He was afraid of Polish or Ottoman meddling if he were to overextend, and was also afraid of French reprisals. But for now, the Brandenburg force was strengthened by volunteers from other German rulers, among which was the deposed Duke of Lorraine, and some of the Emperor's troops led by Raimondo Montecuccoli. Halfway September, the German coalition army arrived in Hildesheim and were now in the war. They took the city and turned to the real goal of the campaign, Münster. But they were hampered by the rain as well. The march slowed to a crawl and diseases broke out. Montecuccoli, likely following orders from the Emperor, convinced the army's leadership to switch targets and to march on Cologne. He had a lot of influence since the Emperor's support was critical for German participation. The army stumbled their way towards Frankfurt. William had left the waterline with an army to link up with the Germans and go on the attack together. He waited in Maastricht, but the Germans never came, as they returned to their winter quarters. With William's absence, Luxembourg crossed the frozen waterline with a small force, but ended up retreating after burning down 2 villages. Both parties entered 1673 unsatisfied. The French hope for a quick and glorious victory had waned away. And in February, Turenne outmaneuvered a renewed German campaign, so the Emperor called it quits. Now that Frederick William was left on his own, his western possessions being plundered, and with the Dutch payment long overdue, Brandenburg dropped out of the war on the 10th of April. During the spring, the French were getting ready for a renewed campaign. Though even under Condé's leadership, they could not breach the waterline. But with the aid of the soon-to-be famous Vauban, Louis managed to crack the heavily fortified Maastricht on the 30th of July. The city's long endurance felt as a small victory to the Dutch, so its fall was a blow to their morale. But on the seas, the Dutch still hadn't lost their edge. The Dutch fleet was anchored behind the sandbars of the former island of Schoneveld. Their lighter ships and familiarity with the local sandbars made it a safe haven. As long as their navy was still afloat, the Anglo-French forces couldn't commit to an amphibious assault. In June, under the leadership of De Ruyter, they defeated the numerically superior Anglo-French fleets in the 2 battles of Schoneveld. In August, a fleet from the Dutch Indonesian colonies was returning. If this fleet was captured by the English, it would spell disaster for the Dutch, as they really needed the money the ships would bring in. So De Ruyter had to leave his safe haven and face the English in the Battle of Texel, and the Dutch won. Although in all of these 3 naval engagements few ships were sunk. But the Anglo-French fleets were so damaged that their offensive capabilities were at an end for the rest of the summer. In June there was a peace conference between the Dutch, French and English. With the recent loss of Maastricht, Louis was certain the Dutch were ready to surrender and give in to his demands. But the Dutch were engaged in negotiations with Spain and the Emperor. The Spanish had already been giving some support to the Dutch. It was clear to Spain and the Emperor that if the Dutch fell, their nearby possessions would be Louis's next target. Despite ruining the previous campaigns, the Emperor decided to play a more active role in the engagement. With the involvement of these 2 powers growing near, the Dutch gave Louis a reply that boiled down to, if you want those occupied territories, first come get the rest. Louis began this war searching for fame, revenge and glory. And with the fall of Maastricht, he had gotten all 3. But from the start, Louis had feared the involvement of the Emperor, which seemed increasingly likely. The Emperor had sent a small number of troops to the bishopric of Trier. As a warning, Louis attacked and occupied most of the bishopric, and then marched on the Alsace. Again, the French intimidation attempts only strengthened their enemy's resolve, and made the Emperor join the alliance of the Hague together with the United Provinces, Spain, and the Duke of occupied Lorraine. Angered, Louis called back more troops from the Netherlands, and seized the city of Trier itself in early September. This outraged the German states and a large number formed up behind the Emperor, and an imperial army amassed under the leadership of Montecuccoli. Near the end of summer, William pulled a fast one on the French. After luring the French to Brabant with a fake offensive, he rushed northwards to the city of Naarden. But Luxembourg eventually saw through the ruse. With his return, William felt forced to storm the city. After 2 days of brutal fighting, the French commander surrendered the city in exchange for a safe retreat on the 13th of September. He was punished with life in prison. Then in October, William led a 25,000-strong Spanish-Dutch army to attack Cologne. Now it was the Dutch turn to act savagely. Pent-up frustration of a year-long humiliating war was vented on the locals. Especially the town of Rheinbach was brutally sacked when they resisted. The target of the campaign was the Colonian capital, Bonn, although the bishop himself had already fled for the city of Köln. In November they were joined by Montecuccoli and his 35,000 men, and together they besieged Bonn. Probably with Rheinbach in the back of their heads, the city quickly surrendered on the 12th. This was a major blow to the French, as the city was not only their allies' capital, but also an important link in their supply chain. In the same year as their high point of Maastricht, they were dealt the blows of Naarden and Bonn. These losses showed the French that they didn't have the men, money, or supplies needed to continue their occupation, and they decided to abandon most of the Netherlands. Although the French occupation was largely over, the war was not. William first wanted to fulfill the obligations to his allies. Lorraine was to be freed, Spain would regain recently lost territories, and the French had to relinquish their occupations in the Holy Roman Empire. Until then, there would be no peace. By now, the French alliance was crumbling. The English had no strong ties to the French, Her Protestant-ish population felt more sympathetic to the Protestant Dutch than the Catholic French. And with Charles's nephew William now at the helm, the English peaced out in February 1674. The bishops had also lost their appetite for war after failures in Groningen, the loss of Bonn, and the new stance of their nominal overlord. So they dropped out in April and May respectively. And with France declared as an official enemy of the Empire, Frederick William was also back in the fold. In response, Sweden and Denmark joined opposite sides. With the tide turned, the Allies came up with a strategy. The Dutch navy would harry Normandy, and their army would invade northern France. The Germans would cross the Rhine, and the Spanish would attack via Roussillon. But the offensive was a failure. William was halted by Condé at the Battle of Seneffe on 11th of August. And although he was outnumbered, Turenne outplayed the Germans in 1675 in his winter campaign. The only success was the Spanish conquest of Roussillon, but they failed to advance further. The war dragged on for 3 more years, and the French managed to hold the upper hand, even with the death of Turenne and the retirement of Condé. Pressured by war fatigue, William had to abandon the war in August of 1678. For the Dutch, the pre-war situation was restored, and Louis was now free to make separate peaces with the others. Lorraine remained occupied, and the emperor lost most of Alsace and ceded a few cities in return for Philippsburg. And Spain paid the largest price, as they lost many territories. For Louis XIV, the war had been a mixed bag. He technically won, but his goal of huge conquests in the Low Countries had failed. Due to his aggressive posturing, an anti-French coalition led by William had been brought to life. And France itself was also not left unscathed, as their economy had been dealt a massive blow by the war, and Louis's war loans would create fertile grounds for a certain revolution 100 years later. The Dutch had suffered heavily during the occupation, and the year 1672 was called the Year of Disaster. It is often considered the official end of the Dutch Golden Age, though its end had been coming for a while due to other factors. But now, the Dutch national debt had risen through the roof, and they were financially ruined. For William, it was a different story though. His star had been rising throughout the war. He eventually became stadholder of the Netherlands, and later even King of England, and for both titles he became known as William III. When provinces came back in Dutch hands during 1673, he purged the local governments and filled them with loyalists. He attempted to centralize more power to himself, although he wasn't entirely successful in this endeavor. William III became the leader of a country that was nearly destroyed in under 2 months. But by standing firm, he became the greatest rival of the Sun King, who had been the bane of the rest of Europe. Although peace was achieved in 1678, it proved short-lived. 10 years later, Europe would once more be engulfed in a war against France, in the 9 Years' War. But that is a story for another time. Whew, that was a long one. Believe it or not, but I plan to have this bad boy finished by mid-January. But uni has been keeping me kinda busy. Therefore, I am postponing the next Frieslands video one more time. There is a project I've had in my head for a while, which is less reliant on animation, so production time should be way shorter. That way I can give y'all some more content to bridge the gap between videos. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, and it didn't leave you clueless, reasonless, nor helpless, then don't forget to leave a like, comment, and press the subscribe button. If you want to be notified when the next video is uploaded, then don't forget to click the bell icon. Have a good one and see y'all next time.